Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
First, though, the Liberal Democrats were the only opposition party who managed to sound genuine when welcoming this election, and they are aiming for a revival fuelled by hopes of softening the Brexit. I'm joined now in the studio by Sophy Cable, who is standing in his former constituency of Twickenham. Hello, Sophy. Thanks for coming on the programme today. Now, it seems as though the Lib Dems' strategy is the kind of 48% mopping up the votes of those dissatisfied and disappointed Remainers with the promise of a second referendum on the deal. Let's just talk about that, because in reality, the only thing you can offer people is a choice between what Theresa May negotiates and the prospect of crashing out of the EU with no deal at all, isn't it?
I think it's more than that. I mean, it isn't just the 48%. There's an awful lot of people who voted to leave who would be very, very concerned if we had an extreme version of Brexit, which is what Theresa May seems to be planning, you know, leaving the single market, leaving the customs union, breaking off our research connections with Europe. And I think, you know, what the Liberal Democrats are speaking to is everybody who is concerned about the potential damage that could be done by this so-called hard Brexit, and we want to be an effective force in Parliament arguing against it. How
about that specific thought of a second referendum on the deal? Because if you think about it, if we're going to leave the EU in 2 years, then the referendum is just going to be on Theresa May's deal or no deal at all, unless the EU member states agree to an extension, which is really very unlikely, isn't it?
Well, we don't know what the world will be like in 2 years' time, but as you rightly say, we could finish up with a very bad deal, or we could finish up with no deal at all, which means crashing out, potentially catastrophic economic consequences. And the Lib Dems say, look, you know, the public have got to have a say on this. I mean, we did vote to leave in the referendum, that's for sure, but not the way in which we were going to leave. And the Lib Dems are saying, you know, let's see what happens in these negotiations, but if it is bad, and if there is no deal, then the British probably have got to have another say.
But then what I'm confused about is what happens. You have another say, but then we're out of the EU.
No, I think the European Union countries will be very pragmatic. I mean, they would accept that if the British are rethinking this, then they're not going to be obstructive about that.
OK. Mr Cable, I do wonder, if you've been in politics so long now that you personally are so wedded to the idea of a second referendum, we could have a look at something that you said back in September at a Fringe event at Lib Dem conference, when you said that the idea of a second referendum is seriously disrespectful and politically utterly counterproductive.
Yes, no, I did say that. In that context, which was immediately after the referendum we just had. Now, we had to accept that the referendum was the way it was and that the public voted the way they did. We're now talking about something totally different. We're talking about getting to the end of the process of negotiation and having some fallback mechanism so that we can stop something disastrous happening. I mean, actually, you know, referendums are not a good way of deciding these in a binary way, these very complex issues. But nonetheless, you know, that was the way that the matter's been resolved, and that's the way the matter's got to be corrected.
OK. Your leader, Tim Farron, in an interview today, said he ruled out doing a coalition with any other party. Do you think that's a bit like me ruling out going on a date with George Clooney? I mean, the offer's not really on the table, is it?
Well, it could have been, and we're just making it absolutely clear that it's not something we want to do or are intending to do.
But that will only happen when polls are closed.
Well, you may think so, but an awful lot of Conservatives are going around the doors at the moment saying the Lib Dems are going to work in a coalition with Labour, and Labour people are going around saying you're going to have a coalition with the Tories. We're making absolutely clear that is not on, we're not doing that. We want to be an effective opposition to the government. There is a real danger at the moment of the Conservatives, Theresa May's Conservatives, winning with a landslide, and doing so in a kind of very kind of scary atmosphere, you know, crushing saboteurs. I mean, this is making it sound like Turkey and Russia. I mean, you know, we don't want that kind of country, and we do need to have a very effective opposition to what is potentially a very arrogant government.
And do you think that the Dems are realistically capable of forming that opposition? I mean, if we need to kind of get real here, you know, you've got 9 MPs, you're around 11% in the polls. I mean, there's lots of talk of a Lib Dem fight back. But are we getting a bit carried away with it here?
Well, I don't think we're going to win a landslide, but we're certainly going to improve on our current position. And the question is how much we improve. And I think once people see the clarity of our position and the fact that uniquely of the major parties, we have been consistent and principled on the issue of Europe and Brexit, and we have a good platform of other policies too, I think our support will increase. And key, I mean, given the way the British voting system works, is not, you know, the average share of the vote is not the key factor. It's whether you can win in your particular constituencies. And we have a solid base of support in many parts of the country, including mine.
You'll forgive some of my scepticism here, because I do remember in the 2015 general election being spun a line by the Lib Dems that you were going to do much better than the share of the vote in the polls, and look what happened there.
No, it happened. No, that 2015 was a disastrous election, but we now have a following wind. We had a headwind in 2015. It could be very different.
Could be very different. This week, of course, your leader, Tim Farron, was forced to clarify that he doesn't think that being gay is a sin. He's also wrestled with the laws over abortion as a committed Christian. If you are trying to pitch yourself, trying to win back those votes of the kind of liberals, if you like, who perhaps feel they don't have a natural home in Labour or the Conservatives at the moment, is Tim Farron really the man to do it?
Yes, and we are a Liberal party in that wider social sense, and his voting record is as of a Liberal MP. I mean, the problem he has as an individual, and it's true of a lot of evangelical Christians and Roman Catholics, is that their religious faith has a certain approach to these problems, but they're also public figures who have to represent their constituencies, which are much more diverse. And I think Tim accepts, and I think, you know, many highly motivated Christians accept that when they're in public life, they've got to reflect the people that they represent. And he's done so, and he's done so in a very liberal way. Does nothing to detract from our broader message about being a socially liberal party.
So he's effectively, you might say, out of step with what...
No, he has a personal faith. And I respect people who have a personal faith. He's struggling with his conscience, as a lot of Christians and indeed Muslims and others are. But he's, when it's come to the crunch, to the voting for gay marriage, voting on these issues, he has voted consistently with in a liberal way, along with the rest of our party. And
you believe that's because he wants to put the views of the people he's representing above his own personal views?
Yes, and it's difficult, because if you are a true, you know, if you have real faith, that is not an easy thing to do. And I think one has to respect people who are grappling with their faith in the way that he is.
Now, we're talking a lot about the election, of course, as you'd expect, but I'm also keen to get your thoughts on the economy at the moment as well. Now, you, of course, were one of the few people who sort of predicted the last financial crash before it happened. And I'm just wondering what your view is on the current economic prospects of the UK, because we have Brexit looming, personal debt levels are still very high. Could we be seeing another recession on the cards?
I'm not predicting recession, but there are some very deep weaknesses in the UK economy. I mean, we did recover from the depths of the financial crisis. I was part of the government that helped to make that recovery happen. But, you know, there are some fundamental weaknesses. We have very low productivity, which is why wages are low. And we did make a start when I was in the government of promoting apprenticeships and industrial strategy, but it's a long-term task. We have a temporary kind of boom taking place at the moment, which is largely fired by personal debt and heavy borrowing, and that is not sustainable. The government finances are not in great shape, and because Brexit will almost certainly produce an economic slowdown, not necessarily a recession, but certainly a slowdown, this will affect government revenue. It will make the managing of the budget even more difficult. Public services in areas like schooling and health are desperately stretched, and we are going to have to provide more funding for that. So this is the dilemma that any party in government is now going to face, and it's not easy.
Are politicians grappling with those issues, do you think?
Well, I think we're beginning to see in the early days of campaign a recognition by the Tories to start with, and indeed by other parties, that we're going to have to face, you know, higher taxation, as well as, you know, continuing discipline over public finance. So what I would like to see, actually, and I wanted this to happen in the coalition years, is a very clear distinction between borrowing to cover the overdraft of the government and borrowing for public investment, you know, building up our infrastructure, you know, broadband, railways, housing, And the government could be getting on with that, borrowing at very, very low rates of interest in order to build up the country and making it more productive. And this Tory government isn't doing it.
So you mentioned there that the Tories are starting to sort of grapple with the idea of higher taxation. Would you support higher taxation?
Well, I think it's going to have to happen, whoever is in government. And the question is how you do it and making sure you do it in a fair way. I mean, where I would start is some of the changes that the Conservatives have brought in since we left the coalition. I mean, why on earth are we cutting corporation tax? It's well, well below the average of developed countries. I mean, I'm pro-business. I mean, I want to see business investing. But all that's happening is that businesses are pocketing the money and they're sitting on it. They're not investing in it because of all the uncertainty around Brexit.
But don't we need to make the UK an attractive place post-Brexit?
Well, I want Britain to be an attractive place to invest in, but that is unnecessary and it is very, very expensive.
So you support Jeremy Corbyn then in saying that corporation tax should be looked at?
Well, certainly on that particular point. I'm not sure I'd go along with all of Jeremy Corbyn's ideas on tax, but on that, yes, definitely.
Now, before you go, I'm quite interested to know, you've had 2 years away from politics now.
Yeah.
How have you found it? How have you been filling your time? Have you taken up gardening? Are you watching box sets into the small hours?
Not gardening, no, I'm not great in the garden. But I've been writing books. I've got a novel appearing in August, September. I work in universities, including my local university in Twickenham and the London School of Economics.
Very serious. What do you do in your downtime?
I still go to my weekly dancing lesson. I love that. And do a lot of cycling, walking, doing the gym, weight training, all those things. So no, I'm very active and hopefully fit. Weight
training, I love that. Can't have been enjoying it that much though, otherwise you wouldn't be back for more. Vince Cable, thank you very much.
I've been getting